Good evening. I hope you're keeping safe and well. For those who don't know me, I'm John Allen, National Chairman of the Paddle Steamer Preservation Society. As you'll be aware, Paul Semple has had to devote all his efforts to returning Waverley to service, and consequently he's unable to prepare his planned presentation for today. So apologise for that. You've got me again instead. So welcome to the fourth of our national and international online meetings for this winter-spring season. In particular, I'd like to welcome all those who don't normally attend branch meetings and those who may be watching from overseas. So without further introduction, let's get started. When people think of paddle steamers, many people think of the classic American stern wheeler. Indeed, it was very disappointing to visit the Millennium Dome exhibition, it's hard to believe it was more than 21 years ago, and see that the only example of a paddle steamer in the transportation section was a model of the completely bogus Thames vessel, Elizabethan. Of course, we know better, and the number of paddlers in Europe, and even down under, far exceed those remaining in the USA. Indeed, the USA has only a handful of operating paddle steamers, a few more diesel vessels, but it's a country not without interest to the steamboat or steamship enthusiast. Where else can you find a coal-fired car ferry, an Edwardian liner, or a floating steam streetcar, for example? We are going to see all three this evening, together with most of the remaining operational sternwheel paddle steamers and a few other vessels of interest. Now, Oscar Wilde said, "We really have everything in common with America nowadays, except, of course, language." It's often misquoted, and I may well slip into a few Americanisms along the way. I will try and translate as necessary. So our first visit to the USA in search of steam was to the West Coast in 1999. Our main goal was indeed a steamship, the wonderful SS Independence, but that's another story perhaps for another time. We also stayed on the Queen Mary at Long Beach. The sub was a Russian Foxtrot class with an audio guide complete with authentic James Bond Russian accent. On the other side of the country, the Big U is still lingering in Philadelphia. But don't worry, this is a PSPS meeting, and I'm not going to dwell on ocean liners. We were also in search of paddlers. We took the coastal Starlight train from Santa Barbara to Sacramento, seen here at San Luis Obispo, during a pause to allow a freight train to pass. It was more useful to allow those smokers on board to have a fag break and for us to take photos. En route, we passed Suisun Bay, one home of the USA's reserve fleet. Some interesting tonnage can be seen in the rafts, including a few victory ships, I think. So here is our first paddler. In Sacramento, we stayed on the magnificent steamer Delta King, sadly no longer plying the Sacramento River, but she lives out her retirement as a very pleasant hotel. Delta King is the sister ship to Delta Queen. The hull, first two decks and steam engines were ordered in 1924 from William Denny and Brothers shipyard at Dumbarton. They were shipped in pieces to Stockton, California in 1926. There, the California Transportation Company assembled the two vessels for their regular service between San Francisco and Sacramento and excursions to Stockton on the San Joaquin River. At the time, they were the most lavishly appointed and expensive sternwheel passenger boats ever commissioned. Driven out of service by a new highway linking Sacramento with San Francisco in 1940, Delta King was laid up and requisitioned by the US Navy for duty in San Francisco Bay as USS Delta King. In November 1940, Delta King was converted by the Navy into a receiving ship for naval reservists. After the war, she served as home to hundreds of men who were constructing the Alcan aluminium plant and the Kimano Dam power project in the early 1950s. She was listed on the National Register of Historic Places in 1978. In 1981, she sank for mysterious reasons while laid up in Richmond, California. It was later found the damage was minor, and she was raised and towed to her current location. She retains the open decks of her sister ship and is still full of atmosphere. Her paddle wheel is not original. She donated her paddle shaft to Delta Queen in 1980. Sacramento has a few small paddlers, although the one on the right looks completely bogus. I thoroughly recommend a visit. Sacramento is not only the state capital of California, but it's also the home to a very fine railway museum. At that time, Sacramento was also the home of this genuine paddle steamer, Elizabeth Louise. She was in private ownership and out of reach of public access, so I have no photographs on board her, nor did we see her in steam. She was built in 1984, but with steam paddle engines dating from 1884, and she subsequently spent some time sailing from Ketchikan, Alaska, as Alaska Queen. She then moved to Seattle and is now named Queen of Seattle, but she's currently out of service and up for sale at an original asking price of $895,000, but now a bargain at $250,000. San Francisco is rightly famous for its cable cars. The system dates from 1873, but this car was built relatively recently in 1992. It also has a historic tram line, running a variety of cars from around the world. This one was built in 1948 for service in Philadelphia. San Francisco is also home to the Liberty ship Jeremiah O'Brien, which some of us will have seen in 1994 when she crossed the Atlantic to participate in the commemorations of the Normandy landings. Who can forget sailing alongside her on Waverley after the Spithead Review? That sailing was probably my favourite of all time aboard Waverley. With typical luck, the enormous paddle ferry Eureka was away for a major refit when we visited the Maritime Museum. But another familiar outline was that of Eppleton Hall. She was built in 1914 by Heppel and Company of South Shields to tow seagoing colliers from sea to the wharf side and back, primarily in the River Wear and to and from the River Tyne. She is one of the last of her type built. She was equipped with twin surface condensing side lever engines of the Grasshopper or half lever type. The saga of Eppleton Hall's acquisition, her rebuild, and her voyage to San Francisco under her own power is a story in its own right. She is now berthed at Hyde Street Pier and was restored to resemble her post-war condition. Sadly, she's not eligible for grants which tend to be reserved for US-built vessels, and the ship is not currently open to the public. We start our serious paddling on a lake, albeit a rather small one. Disney World in Florida does indeed have a genuine paddle steamer, Liberty Belle, albeit one guided by an underwater I-beam. She came into service named Richard F. Irvin on May the 20th, 1973, but was renamed Liberty Belle in 1996 after everything except for the hull, boiler and engines was stripped off, and an all-new superstructure was constructed. So let's take a sail. Listen carefully to the commentary.
Last call. Secure all cargo. All passengers aboard. Cargo secured. All passengers boarded, sir. All hands stand by. Engine room. Reverse 1/4. Balance. Stand off bow line. Aye, aye, sir. Bow line away. Engine room. At 1/4. Down last bell. Leadman, sound off. Give me a depth reading by the mark.
You can hear the terms Mark I, Mark Twain, Mark III, and Mark IV. Mark Twain is, of course, the famous steamboat pilot and author, whose real name was Samuel Langhorne Clemens. His pen name came from his years working on Mississippi riverboats, where 2 fathoms, a depth indicating safe water for passage of a boat, was measured on the sounding line. Twain is a term for two, and the riverboatman's cry was Mark Twain, or more fully, by the Mark Twain, meaning, according to the mark on the line, the depth is 2 fathoms. That is, the water is 12 feet deep and is safe to pass. So now you know.
And if you follow the wilderness trail there, it'll lead you right up to the gates of Fort Langley. It's the last trading outpost before we head into Indian country.
Walt Disney loved railroads, and Disney World purchased 5 locomotives from the United Railways of Yucatan on Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula in 1969. This locomotive is named after the great man himself and is a 460, built in 1925. Florida is also home to a lot of alligators, and you can see them at very close quarters. This was not taken with a telephoto lens. I think you can tell the editor of Paddle Wheels wasn't very happy about me filming this. There's a caption competition in there, I think. Before we leave Florida, there is one more steamboat to show you. Key Largo is home to the original African Queen, co-star of the 1951 John Huston movie, starring Humphrey Bogart and Katharine Hepburn. She was actually built in Lytham in 1912 for service in Africa. When we saw her, as shown here, in 2009, she was semi-derelict, but I understand that she has now been restored to steam. I also have a curiosity to show you. The Bahia Honda Bridge was originally part of the Overseas Railroad, which ran down the Florida Keys. When it closed, a rather hairy-looking road was built over the top, but the bridge is now disused. The Overseas Railroad, also known as Flagler's Folly, was an extension of Henry Flagler's Florida East Coast Railway to Key West. It only operated from 1912 to 1935, when it was partially destroyed by a hurricane and never rebuilt. Our next operational steamer is the Minnehaha, dating from 1906. The eastern tip of Lake Minnetonka is located in Minnesota, approximately 12 miles west of the Twin Cities, Minneapolis-St. Paul. Its name translates from the Sioux's Big Water, and it's a large complex of inlets and bays. In 1855, the lake saw the first steamboat, and in 1867, the first railroad was completed to Wayzata. The 1870s brought many smaller steamboats to Lake Minnetonka. They were needed if one wanted to get from place to place around the densely wooded lake. In the early summer of 1905, Twin City Rapid Transit streetcars, or trams to you and me, began rolling westward to Excelsior. They could carry passengers to and from the lake, but how was the company going to move passengers to and from the streetcars? By streetcar boat, of course. The centerpiece of the fleet was a team of 6 fast torpedo-stern steamers that would serve lake residents by running a tight schedule similar to the company's streetcars. The new boats even looked like streetcars. They were finished with the same canary yellow paint and were named after major destinations on the TCRT's trolley system: Como, Harriet, Hopkins, Minnehaha, Stillwater, and White Bear. Minnehaha has been heavily reconstructed, but her searchlight is one of the original bits. Their seating capacity and interior decoration were identical to those of their land-based cousins. The seats are very obviously streetcar seats. At the far end of Lake Minnetonka is Wayzata, with a fine preserved station building. Passenger services ceased many years ago. Burlington Northern Santa Fe still run freights, and I put this in not for the train, but for the track. Have a look at it bending visibly as the heavy cars roll past.
Anybody, especially you people on the upper deck that have sensitive ears, you may want to cover them now. Here we go.
Let us watch Minnehaha leaving Wayzata. She has a triple expansion steam engine. By the early 1920s, the automobile was well on its way to becoming the preferred mode of transportation in Minnesota. It was the beginning of the end for Lake Minnetonka's steamboats. In July of 1926, workers dismantled 3 of the fleet's 7 boats, the Como, the White Bear, and the Minnehaha, and scuttled them. In the summer of 1979, a diver found the remains of Minnehaha 60 feet below the surface, half buried in mud. Her cypress hull seemed to be in good shape. A year later, she was recovered. After nearly 6 years of restoration work, the resurrected Minnehaha was ready to return to Lake Minnetonka. She was based at Excelsior and operated a variety of short cruises until 2019, but I understand she's currently out of service. Let us now look at the preserved side-wheeler Ticonderoga, the last paddle steamer on Lake Champlain, now high and dry at the Shelburne Museum. Ticonderoga is the last walking beam side-wheel passenger steamer in existence. Commissioned by the Champlain Transport Company, she was built in 1906 at the Shelburne Shipyard in Shelburne, Vermont, on Lake Champlain. When more modern ferries made her obsolete, Ticonderoga managed to persist in operation as an excursion boat for several years. However, by 1950, the steady decline in business threatened her future. She was saved from the scrap heap and purchased for the Shelburne Museum. While they attempted to keep her in operation, the steamboat era had passed, making it difficult to find qualified personnel to operate and maintain her. Now, does that sound familiar? In 1954, Shelburne Museum decided to move Ticonderoga by rail 2 miles overland to the museum grounds. It's a pity she cannot steam anymore, but at least she's safe. Her walking beam engine was built by the Fletcher Engine Company of Hoboken, New Jersey, and was supplied by 2 coal-fired boilers. On the left, you can see the single cylinder, and at the top right, you can just see the walking beam. Her big end and crank, and her pressure gauges. Today, the Ticonderoga portrays life on board in 1923. Much of her interior has been restored to its original grandeur. Here we see her paddle shaft steps. This is one of her passenger cabins, and here is her garage. Her public rooms retain their butternut and cherry panelling, and her ceilings retain their gold stenciling. Here is her dining room, and her main staircase. Her stateroom halls are magnificent. Perhaps she is the last reminder of the magnificently furnished paddlers which plied their trade over here and abroad in the early years of the last century. Note the T symbol on the carpet. Ticonderoga was declared a National Historic Landmark in 1964. Now let's move on to the Great Lakes and look at a remarkable survivor. SS Keewatin is a passenger liner that carried passengers and freight between Lake Superior and Lake Huron for the Canadian Pacific Railway's Great Lakes steamship service. As her builder's plate shows, she was built at Govan by Fairfields. She was launched in July 1907, crossed the Atlantic under her own steam in September that year, and entered service just over a year later. She had to be cut in 2 sections in Quebec City for passage through the rapids above Montreal and the Welland Canal, and she was reunited at Buffalo, New York. She is claimed to be the last of the classic Great Lakes passenger steamships still in existence, and the last Edwardian passenger liner in the world. She ran continuously for almost 60 seasons, being retired towards the end of 1965. Soon after, she was acquired for preservation and arrived in Douglas, Michigan in 1967, and we visited her when she was there. She has been beautifully maintained and is well looked after. Her interior is complete with pot plants, and her stateroom hall features stained glass clerestories. This is a double cabin, one up, one down. This one has a convertible settee, and this one has both a bed and settee. This looks like a civilized spot to take tea, but have a look at the box on the right. It features something we are familiar with. It's painted to look like wood. I know there's a name for it, said our guide. Scumbling, we said in stereo. Her public rooms are magnificent. This is a piano lounge. The lobbies are richly decorated with superb panelling and this clock. The purser's office, and here is an officer's cabin. She has a traditional wheelhouse, and this is the captain's cabin. Now I must admit I'd never seen one of these before, but seafaring friends have said they were very common. It's the Kelvite Mark IV hand-driven sounding machine from Kelvin, Bottomley and Baird, Cambridge Street, Glasgow. Her steam capstan is below deck level. And here we are in her engine room. Her quadruple expansion steam engines produce 3,300 horsepower and are claimed to be the last in existence. Here are the control levers and the gauge board. She has hand-stoked coal-fired Scotch boilers. She stayed in Douglas for 45 years, moving to her old home port of Port McNicoll in Canada on the 23rd of June 2012, 45 years to the day after she left, and 100 years to the day after she started work from there. She was open to visitors until the end of 2019, but she did not open last year, and I understand her future location is currently somewhat uncertain. Moving on, we come to Lake Manaste, a small lake connected to Lake Michigan, which is home to the SS City of Milwaukee. She was built for the Grand Trunk Milwaukee Car Ferry Company in 1931 at Manitowoc, Wisconsin, to replace SS Milwaukee, which sank with all hands on October the 22nd, 1929, during a gale. She was declared a National Historic Landmark in 1990. She is the last unmodified traditional railroad car ferry afloat. Her passenger accommodation is much more workaday than Keewatin's, with lino flooring, perhaps reflecting her role as a humble ferry. But her staterooms look comfortable. This is her dining room, and the galley with its coal-fired range. Her deck machinery is on show. This is her windlass. and she retains her triple expansion steam engine. When we saw her, she was something of a work in progress, but she's now open as a seasonal bed and breakfast and event venue, as well as a museum. Our final lake is Lake Michigan, and here we are at Ludington, with a remarkable lineup. We will hear a lot more about the two twins on the left, Badger and Spartan, in a minute, but have a look at the two vessels on the right. The ferry was built by the Great Lakes Engineering Company of Ecorse, Michigan, and sailed on her maiden voyage in 1917 as Ann Arbor No. 6. She was renamed Arthur K. Atkinson in 1958 and at some point was dieselized. She was taken out of service in 1982. A proposed conversion to a casino ship fell through, don't they all? And she left Ludington in 2003 for Detroit, Michigan. She was scrapped at Sault Ste. Marie in 2012. The barge started out life as the SS City of Midland, built by the Manaste Shipbuilding Company in 1940 at a cost of $1.75 million. One of the last coal-burning car ferries on Lake Michigan, she entered service for the Père Marquette Railway Company in March 1941 as the largest Great Lakes ferry ever built, powered by two Skinner Uniflow steam engines. She steamed alongside Badger and Spartan until 1979, when Spartan was laid up, and she steamed on alone from 1984, when Badger was also laid up. In 1988, it was decided to refurbish the younger Badger, and in 1997, City of Midland was converted to the barge we see here, Père Marquette No. 41. She is still in service. So let's have a look at the other two. Badger is perhaps one of the most remarkable survivors of all. She was constructed as a rail car ferry by the Christie Corporation of Sturgeon Bay, Wisconsin, with a reinforced hull for ice braking, and she was launched in 1952, entering service in 1953 for the Chesapeake and Ohio Railway. The ship is named after the University of Wisconsin's athletics team, the Wisconsin Badgers. She is powered by Skinner Uniflow engines, manufactured by the Skinner Company of Erie, Pennsylvania. After 1972, only the route between Ludington and Kewaunee, Wisconsin remained, and by 1983 the Chessie system ended its car ferry service when it sold the steamers Badger, Spartan and City of Midland to the Michigan-Wisconsin Transportation Company to continue the operation. By November 1988, the Badger was the only vessel running. On November 16, 1990, she was laid up, ending 93 years of railway car ferry service out of Ludington and 98 years on Lake Michigan as a whole. After sitting idle for a year, the three remaining ferries were purchased by entrepreneur and philanthropist Charles F. Conrad. He undertook a major overhaul and refit of the Badger exclusively for carrying passengers and cars. Returning to service in 1992 on the Ludington to Manitowoc route, the vessel has carried hundreds of thousands of passengers and vehicles across the lake. She is the last coal-fired passenger vessel operating on the Great Lakes and the last large coal-burning steamship in the United States. So let's take a sail on her. Cars check in at this kiosk, shaped like her funnel. Badger's large deck space allows it to transport tractor-trailers and larger commercial loads, and her season was extended in 2015 to carry wind turbine loads. You load your luggage onto a little cart. not forgetting anything. And the cart is towed onto the ship. One of our trips was on Independence Day, July the 4th, so patriotic music and Uncle Sam were in evidence. Note the guy checking the draft. And so we're away. Spartan is named after the mascot of Michigan State University, and she shared with Badger a double christening ceremony in 1952. In 1979, she was the first of the 3 remaining ferries to be withdrawn. Today she is used as a parts ship to keep her twin running. Note the car ramp, used to load cars onto her upper decks when railroad cars filled the lower decks. So let us watch her go. We never did discover the significance of the lone piper. The former upper car decks are now enclosed and offer a number of entertainment options and eating facilities on board. Her restaurant servery is rather typical 1950s chrome and formica, and entertainment in the main lounge includes the inevitable bingo. If that gets a bit much, she has a quiet room which doubles as a museum. She operates overnight, but her passenger staterooms are a bit Spartan in nature. Her beds fold away as space is limited. So here we are, crossing the lake. It's a nice sunny day. And here she is arriving at Manitowoc. Let's watch what goes on. She has to turn as she has no bow doors. The docking bridge is glazed, so you can see what is going on. The stern gate is open, ready for arrival. Look at the wind-up telephone, still in use. In 2009, she was placed on the National Register of Historic Places by the US Department of the Interior. On arrival, an army of seasonal workers unload the cars. She is a great source of employment for students in the summer vacation. Because of her size and strong construction, the SS Badger rarely misses a sailing due to poor weather. This was not the best of days, as you can see from the waves breaking on the right-hand harbour arm. I'm not sure that I would want to walk out there on a day like this. Her coal firing has caused problems, as she used to dump her ash in the lake, which is a source of drinking water for many. She was threatened with withdrawal in 2012, but plans to convert her to run on gas, which produces no residue, gained her a temporary reprieve. The gas option was eventually discarded for an ash retention system, and this was fitted in time for service in 2015. Touch wood, the adaptation was successful, and let us hope that the last coal-fired car ferry in the world steams on for many more years to come. I cannot recommend her too highly. Before we leave the area, let's visit the National Railroad Museum at Green Bay and see something rather familiar. LNER A4 Pacific Dwight D. Eisenhower arrived at the museum in 1964. She was loaned to our own National Railway Museum for the Great Gathering of 2013 and was being prepared for the journey when this photo was taken, hence the taped-up openings. As part of the loan agreement, the National Railway Museum performed a cosmetic restoration and she returned to Green Bay in 2014. Let us now move to the Great Mississippi itself. New Orleans, or N'Orleans as they like to call it there, is famous for jazz, French colonial architecture, and it's also got some rather nice streetcars. Natchez is seen here at her birth by the Monument to the Immigrant. She is modelled on the packet boat Hudson, which steamed from 1886 to 1905 between Pittsburgh and Cincinnati. She was built in 1975 by the Bergeron Machine Shop at Braithwaite, Louisiana. And she's a genuine steam sternwheeler in the classic style. A calliope, or steam organ, greets you when it's time to step on board. As you can see, it doesn't rain very often in New Orleans. Natchez operates sightseeing tours. She offers daily lunch and dinner cruises with special cruises on special days. Now, if anyone needs a Christmas present idea for a ship's captain, how about one of these? Her engine room and boiler room are open to view whilst she is steaming. They're well labelled and excellent views can be had. Her engines are second-hand from the Clareton, a towboat dating from 1927, which plied her trade from Pittsburgh to New Orleans until 1960. Now, a towboat doesn't tow anything. It pushes a raft of barges, and this raft is known as a tow. Her engines are tandem compound, with high pressure and low pressure cylinders driving a common connecting rod on each side of the ship. Her boilers are modern and oil-fired. Her passenger accommodation is pleasant enough and traditional in style. This is one of her bars. And here is another. And this is her lounge. So we leave Natchez in New Orleans, here giving a farewell whistle. And we join our next paddle steamer, Delta Queen, and settle into our little one-up, one-down cabin. New Orleans was the starting point for the 2001 Great Steamboat Race between the legendary Delta Queen and the magnificent Mississippi Queen, which we see here commemorating the notorious race between the Natchez of 1869 and the Robert E. Lee, between New Orleans and St. Louis. Now, I always thought it was named after Louis IX of France, but over there it's called St. Louis, named, we assume, after the current Formula One motor racing champion. The original race finished in St. Louis on Independence Day, and ours was duly scheduled to do the same. But whereas the original was a flat-out race with commercial honours at stake, ours consisted of 3 racing stages interspersed with what the brochure called passenger and crew activities. Being British and somewhat reserved, we determined not to get involved with such enforced jollity before we went. Ah well, that's not quite how it turned out. Here we see the captain of the Mississippi Queen challenging Delta Queen to the race. And here we see Mississippi Queen leaving New Orleans prior to the first racing leg. Behind her is the cruise ship Enchanted Capri, which started out life in 1975 as the Azerbaijan. At the time we saw her, she'd just been arrested. You can see that Mississippi Queen's Calliope is being played. She featured a 44-whistle steam Calliope, which was the largest on the Mississippi River system. Now, it's unusual to see me overdressed, but here we are. I'm wearing the only DJ on board, with Captain Gabe Chengeri. He is otherwise known as Captain Keyboard. Here he entertained us specially with an English country garden. So keen is he on Calliopes that he actually owns the original one from the Belle of Louisville and tours the USA with it. Sadly, not all the players were quite so talented. This effort was labelled jazz by one of the musicians who was officiating at the time. Vicksburg was one of the stops, and Vicksburg is where Coca-Cola was first bottled. And here we see the contrasting paddle wheels of the two queens, Delta Queen's rimmed wheel and Mississippi Queen's rimless version. A sad relic of paddlers past can be found at Vicksburg, Sprague was the world's largest steam-powered stern-wheeler towboat. She was decommissioned as a towboat in 1948 and became a museum on the Vicksburg waterfront. But she was wrecked and burned on the 15th of May 1974, and this is all that remains of her. Vicksburg is the site of a major Civil War encounter, and one of the victims was the City-class ironclad paddle gunboat USS Cairo, or Cairo to you and me. Commissioned in 1862, she lasted less than a year before becoming the first ship in history to be sunk by an electrically detonated torpedo. Her remains were lifted in 1964, and in 1977 she was put on display near the Vicksburg National Cemetery. She still has the remains of her inboard paddle wheel, a feature common to most US warships of that era, for obvious reasons. USS Cairo is named after the confluence of the Ohio and Mississippi rivers. You really can see the join here, with the clear blue waters of the Ohio separated from the brown, muddy Mississippi. When we were not racing, we cruised in company. It gave us a good opportunity to admire Mississippi Queen. Here she shows off her party piece, waggling her ears by lowering her two stacks, funnels to you and me, or perhaps lums in Scotland, independently. Steamboating USA is a very friendly affair, and people embellish their cabins. A map is available for everyone to stick pins in, showing where they come from. We stuck our pin on the far right of the map, with an arrow pointing east, and as we were the only foreigners on board, we quickly gained celebrity status. That celebrity status was increased when we were flooded out of our little cabin by the elderly couple above us, who thought their sprinkler head would make a really neat coat hanger. Our little cabin was deemed unusable for the rest of the trip, so we ended up in the Ohio stateroom. We weren't too upset at that, it has to be said, so let's have a look over the rest of the ship. This is the Betty Blake Lounge, named after the lady who spearheaded the campaign to gain the exemption for her wooden superstructure from the safety at sea legislation, which would have halted her career in 1966. Her cabin lounge is the venue for light breakfasts, coffee, hot dogs and popcorn. It's also where her magnificent staircase bottoms out. The Orleans Room is her restaurant, which doubles as a show lounge after dinner when all the tables are cleared. No purpose-built theatre here. Now, the gym on any ship can be a bit of a torture chamber, but Delta Queen's has location, if nothing else. Her pilot house is the usual steamship mix of ancient and modern, with a particularly fine telegraph. But I have deliberately called it a pilot house. It is not a wheelhouse. It has no wheel, steering being controlled by the lever you can see here. A brass plaque reads, "Engines built 1925 by C.H. Evans & Co. San Francisco." Most of the steam engine actually came from Scotland, although the Child H. Evans Company is credited with the design and installation once they got to California. The two water tube boilers were bought new, but from World War I surplus dating back to 1919. The engines are horizontal cross compound, with one cylinder on either side. Part of the machinery from the Delta King lives on aboard its twin sister. In 1954, a piston rod broke and lodged in one of the cylinders, nearly ending the career of Delta Queen. This was, of course, pre-9/11, and Delta Queen's engine room was open to full, unimpeded access during all this racing. This all changed with 9/11, and our last visit was tightly controlled and only when the ship was alongside. So I don't have any video of her. This was the final racing leg, and here we see her ahead of Mississippi Queen, with her wheel covered in spray, as was Mississippi Queen's. Everything hinged on this race. Both ships had won one leg, but sadly, despite the efforts of Captain Keyboard and his crew, Delta Queen's boiler started to play up, and the final leg of racing was won by Mississippi Queen. Here we see her approaching the Gateway Arch in St. Louis at the end of the race, and she won the Golden Antlers, the trophy for the race itself. There was one advantage to losing, however. We did get to go on the winner. This is the results board showing that Delta Queen had won the Commodore's Cup for the Frolics. Note the comment, yeah, whatever. Captain Keyboard was duly presented with the cup. And we did get to see Mississippi Queen's engine. Her engine room was open to view, albeit behind glass, with magnificent tandem compound machinery newly built for the ship. So we leave them both in St. Louis, and we would never see Mississippi Queen again. She was caught up in a refit that never finished, and she was scrapped in 2011. It was a scandal. Some parts of her do survive, but I've been unable to find any information about whether this includes her engine. Delta Queen, 50 years her senior, steamed on under an exemption to the SOLAS regulations, which banned ships with wooden superstructures from overnight voyages. 2008 was the year that her exemption expired, and political problems with her owners suggested it was unlikely that her exemption would be renewed. We decided to make one last trip from Nashville on the Cumberland River, where she is seen here, to Cincinnati, her home port, on the Ohio River. General Jackson is a genuine paddler, built by Jeff Boat in Jeffersonville, Indiana, and launched in 1985. Though built to resemble a vintage steam-powered riverboat, she's actually powered by diesel generators, which in turn power two 600 horsepower electric motors, which in turn propel a 24-foot diameter, 36-ton stern wheel. She was originally an attraction at the Opryland USA theme park. The park closed in 1997, but the boat remains in service. So let us leave Nashville. Here we see Captain Larry Wilkinson on the bridge wing, overseeing the departure. Now this is known in steamboating circles as choking a stump or tying up to a tree trunk. Here she leaves Dover, complete with her calliope playing. Let's just enjoy it. Her early history is the same as the Delta Kings, as we have already heard. But in 1946, Delta Queen was purchased by Green Line of Cincinnati, Ohio, and towed via the Panama Canal and the Mississippi and Ohio rivers to be refurbished in Pittsburgh. In 1948, she entered regular passenger service, plying the waters of the Ohio, Mississippi, Tennessee, and Cumberland rivers between Cincinnati, New Orleans, St. Paul, Chattanooga, Nashville, and ports in between. Ownership of the vessel has changed many times since then. Delta King's wheel is still in service. Let's just admire her as she passes Palmyra. Now, on any cruise ship, if a large crowd is all heading in the same direction, it can only mean one thing. Yes, folks, it's time to eat. Our cruise director was Banjo Bob Stevens, and here he is entertaining the diners.
But you look sweet upon the scene of Mexico. Let me hear you sing now.
He is standing in front of her bell. Pickwick Bell is another authentic paddler, seen here entering the lock at Pickwick Dam on the Tennessee River. You can see her two stern wheels moving independently to maneuver her. In 2012, she moved a short way to Wheeler Lake on the Tennessee River, where she cruised for a while from Decatur, Alabama, She now undertakes only charters. Well, it all came to an end far too soon. Once again, we were privileged to be invited to the captain's table for the final dinner. The Calliope was to be played that night, and Larry Wilkinson tried hard to convince a little girl at the table that the engineer loaded jello into the boiler to get the coloured lighting effects. He was a lovely man and assured us that he would not let them take his boat away from him. But they did, and he was made redundant shortly afterwards. Even more tragically, he passed away 2 years later. But here we can enjoy the floodlit Calliope and the effect of the jello in the boiler. 2008 turned out to be the swan song not only of Delta Queen, but also American Queen, as Majestic America went bust. Delta Queen became a hotel in Chattanooga, albeit with the stated intent of doing nothing to jeopardize her return to steam. Coincidentally, although we were supposed to finish our cruise in Cincinnati, we too ended up in Chattanooga, as the Ohio River was closed, and this is where we see her. American Queen was impounded by the Maritime Administration and used to process refugees from the flooding in New Orleans. As I said earlier, Mississippi Queen had been scrapped, barely 30 years old. For 3 seasons, there were no opportunities to sail overnight on the rivers of the USA. So when American Queen returned to service in 2012, we had to take a trip. Her calling points all have their points of interest. This is Wheeling, West Virginia, which has an overwhelming atmosphere of faded glory, including this barber's shop which caught my eye, complete with rotating traditional spiral sign. The operation is quite innovative. Steam buses, vinyled to resemble the American Queen herself, follow the ship around and run a free hop-on, hop-off service around her ports of call. There are 3 of them. It's an excellent idea and suits the places in Middle America that she visits, which are generally small, very well. Places like Marietta. American Queen is said to be the largest river steamboat ever built. The ship was built in 1995 and is a 6-deck recreation of a classic Mississippi riverboat built by McDermott Shipyard for the Delta Queen Steamboat Company. Many places have river museums, and the one at Marietta is particularly noteworthy. The steamboat Tell City was built in 1889 and carried passenger and freight on the Ohio River until she sank following an accident at Little Hocking, Ohio on April 6, 1917. The pilot house was removed from the wreck and served as a summer house until presented to the museum. This is the oldest surviving pilot house in the USA. But the star exhibit is the beautiful towboat, W.P. Snyder, Jr. She is a stern-wheel, steam-driven towboat that was originally built as the Carnegie Steel Company towboat W.H. Klingerman in 1918 by Reese & Sons Company of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. In 1938, she was renamed J.L. Perry. In August 1945, she was sold to the Crucible Steel Company of Pittsburgh and renamed the W.P. Snyder Jr. in September 1945. She towed coal on the Monongahela River until being laid up on 23rd of September 1953 at Crucible, Pennsylvania. In the summer of 1955, the boat was given to the Ohio River Museum. As one of the first steel towboats constructed, she was fitted with the prominent anti-hogging struts and cables necessary on wooden-hulled sternwheelers. At the time, it wasn't known if they'd be needed with steel hull construction. She is the only intact steam-driven sternwheel towboat still on the river system of the USA and is a US National Historic Landmark. She too has a tandem compound engine. This is her boiler room, with boilers built by the Titusville Ironworks Company in Titusville, Pennsylvania. She was mechanically stoked, and she really does have a wheelhouse with an enormous wheel. Here we see her rudder posts and her steam capstan engine. Her accommodation is, as you would expect for a towboat, basic. This is her captain's desk, and her washing machine is a vintage model. You eat at the kitchen table, and food is cooked on a coal-fired range. Now, Point Pleasant, West Virginia, has a somewhat macabre history. On 15th of December 1967, just before Christmas, the Silver Bridge collapsed in the middle of the rush hour. 46 people lost their lives. The associated Mothman legend was featured in the 2002 film The Mothman Prophecies, starring Richard Gere and Alan Bates. Well, we did finally make it to Cincinnati on a paddler. Have a close look in the background. It is home to a replica of American Queen's stern wheel, and the vertical pipes are a rather bizarre street calliope. Many people think of a showboat as a magnificent paddle steamer. The truth is that most of them were barges. Until recently, the Majestic was the last active historic showboat on the rivers. Built in Pittsburgh in 1923, Majestic travelled along the Ohio River until 1965, when the Coast Guard decided that the wooden hull was too decrepit for travel. She was sold to the city of Cincinnati in 1967, where she was still being used as an old-time showboat when we visited in 2012, but she closed late in 2013. She moved to Manchester, Ohio, and moved again, as recently as February this year, to New Richmond, where she will become part of a designated outdoor refreshment area. The ferry in the background, a barge powered by a towboat, gives some idea as to how the Majestic would have worked in practice. Cincinnati is home to a couple of completely bogus paddlers, but Mark Twain is the genuine article, diesel-powered and chain-driven. In the woods behind the paddler is a statue to the redoubtable Captain Mary Becker Greene. She was the only female steamboat captain in Ohio and at one time owner of the Green Line of river steamboats. She died in 1949 aboard her boat, Delta Queen, and is said to haunt the boat to this day. If she gets tired, she can sit on an original seat from one of her Green Line steamers. On leaving Cincinnati, we were completely taken by surprise to see Boone No. 7, originally a steam paddle ferry built in 1935, but dieselized in 1947. We were lucky to see her. She is not in regular service. So let's have a look over American Queen. This was our cabin. It was furnished in antique style, complete with a painting of 2 paddle steamers. The Mark Twain Gallery is a lounge, used amongst other things for the captain's cocktail party. It has a beautiful model of Delta Queen. They still love the old ship. This is the gentleman's card room, with murals showing manly pursuits. If you don't believe me, there's even a sign. This is the ladies' parlour with nice floral designs. The main deck lounge is where the scrum before dinner takes place, and it's at the bottom of the main staircase. The engine room bar has evening entertainment and a lovely painting of Delta Queen passing a towboat. This ship does have a proper theatre, and it's on 2 levels. The front porch cafe serves light breakfast and all-day popcorn and hot dogs. The dining room is named after and modelled on that of the great steamer J.M. White. Her pilot house is modern, with no wheel but 2 steering levers. Her library does have a wheel, but it's for decoration only. And here we are on the foredeck with her bell and a plaque. Now I put this in really simply to show the names of Jack and Margaret Swan, who we met on Delta Queen. We took them on Waverley from Newport to Ilfracombe, and we exchange Christmas cards every year. Sadly, Jack passed away a few years ago, but we got a card from Margaret this year. All those with sensitive ears or any appreciation of music should cover them now. Look at the hostess. A calliope well maintained and well played is a thing of wonder. Eat your heart out, Jimi Hendrix, and look out for the bloke walking past with his hands over his ears. Most of the time on the river, her stern wheel provides the propulsion. Her engine is from the dredger Kennedy. When we visited the engine room, it was good to see 2 young engineers on duty, and particularly good that one of them was a young lady. Judging by the modern air cylinder, the engine has been somewhat adapted. While the young pair of engineers were doing all the hard work, the chief was supervising from a safe distance. Although American Queen's stern paddle wheel is powered by a genuine steam plant, her secondary propulsion, used in cases of emergency and for manoeuvrability, comes from a set of diesel-electric propellers known as Z-drives on either side of the stern wheel. We can hear Belle of Louisville's Calliope playing, and it looks like American Queen is trying to compete. She is a lovely ship. She was featured on one of Jane McDonnell's cruising programs, and I thoroughly recommend a trip. We have one more paddler to go, but before we do that, let's have a look at another American icon. Louisville, or Louisville as it's known locally, has been home to many famous people, and Cave Hill Cemetery is where many of them are laid to rest, including Patty Hill and Mildred J. Hill, sisters who composed Happy Birthday, Muhammad Ali, who was born in the city, but perhaps the best known over here is this one, the founder of Kentucky Fried Chicken, Colonel Harlan Sanders. Belle of Louisville is a centenarian. She will be 107 this year. She is the oldest paddle steamer in service in the USA and runs sightseeing and dining cruises from her home city throughout the summer. Let's listen to her calliope as she awaits her passengers. She was built in 1914 by J. Reese & Sons in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, for the West Memphis Steam Packet Company, for whom she sailed as Idlewild. She linked Memphis and West Memphis across the Mississippi River, primarily as a passenger ferry, but she also carried light cargo. A change of ownership early in 1928 saw her sailing as a freighter for the New St. Louis and Calhoun Packet Company, specializing in the transport of apples. Out of season, she offered passenger sailings throughout much of the Mississippi River system, From 1931, she was based on the Ohio River at Louisville, mainly as a passenger ferry. In fact, she had a very varied life during World War II, as a towboat and as a nightclub for the military. Her engines are original and of the tandem compound type. Her boiler room can be easily viewed. After the war, she was renamed Avalon and was sold once more to the steamer Avalon Corporation, who used her as a passenger steamer on the Mississippi and its tributaries, and she is claimed to be the most widely travelled excursion steamer on that river system. This business came to an unfortunate end after the 1961 season, when the company could no longer afford her annual overhaul, and she was bought at auction by Jefferson County, in which Louisville is situated, and the boat was renovated, partly with the help of volunteer workers and public donations, re-emerging under her current name, Belle of Louisville. She has received continuous maintenance since then, despite a setback in 1997, when she sank at her moorings in an act of sabotage by a disgruntled ex-employee. She was back in service the following year. So let's have a look around her. Lunchtime cruises feature an optional buffet, with its inevitable line, or cue to you and me. She has a ballroom, and a bluegrass band serenades the participants. Her upper deck is for those not eating. It's quite Spartan. Her nice ticket office is no longer in use. You buy your tickets ashore. In 1989, she was declared a National Historic Landmark, as this plaque commemorates. So let's have a final look at her as she goes about her daily business. So what of the future? Delta Queen is owned by the Delta Queen Steamboat Company. She was towed to Houma, Louisiana in March 2015 to be refurbished to her original condition. In November 2018, she regained her exemption once more, allowing her to resume cruising. She was projected to return to service in 2020, but that was before life changed due to the pandemic. It is, as always, down to money. Her boilers have not got any younger and need major refurbishment. That will be expensive. But wouldn't it be great to celebrate her centenary in 2026? Not as a hotel somewhere, but back where she belongs, back on the river, keeping up the tradition of steamboating USA. Thank you for watching. I hope that I may have inspired you to take a trip to the USA when we're allowed to travel there once again. There is much of interest. I'm delighted to say that Kingswear Castle has already entered service, operating harbour cruises in and around Dartmouth, as she did in 2020. Please go down there and support her. The combination of a beautifully maintained paddle steamer, steam trains and beautiful scenery really is unmissable. I'm speaking today because Paul Semple is busy preparing Waverley for service. Please keep an eye on her website for details of when and where. And again, please support her as much as possible when she does come back into service. If you've enjoyed this talk and you are not yet a member of the Paddle Steamer Preservation Society, please consider joining us. This has been the last of our online meetings this season. I hope we'll be able to return to face-to-face meetings next winter, but I suspect we'll try a few more of these online meetings as well. I hope to see many of you on board Kingsway Castle and Waverley in 2021. So for now, stay safe. See you soon.